Welcome to Woven English. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire sealed off the land routes between Europe and Asia. Spice merchants in Venice, Genoa, and Lisbon suddenly had a problem. Not because they had lost gold, not because they had lost land, because they had lost access to pepper. Pepper, the tiny black seed. The thing you shake onto your eggs in the morning without thinking. Historians point to geopolitics, military strategy, and religious tension as the causes of the age of exploration. But there is one cause that barely makes the textbooks: the desperate, almost obsessive European need for this single spice. Christopher Columbus did not sail west to find a new continent. He sailed west to find pepper and other spices. He just got very lost in the process. Vasco da Gama rounded the entire continent of Africa through storms and starvation and scurvy to reach India, not for gold, not for land, for pepper. The Portuguese Empire, the Dutch Empire, and the British East India Company. Three of the most powerful economic forces in history were all built, in significant part, around this seed. And today, you can buy a jar of it for $2. So how did a tiny black berry from the jungles of southern India become the most sought-after commodity on Earth, and then become something we forget to refill for 6 months? And before we begin, write in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is in your country right now. Now, let's begin. To understand pepper, you have to start with your tongue. When a peppercorn hits the back of your throat, you feel heat. That heat comes from a compound called piperine. Piperine does something unusual in the body. It stimulates the pain receptors in your mucous membranes. The same receptors that fire when you touch something hot. Your body's response is to increase blood flow and saliva production. This is not just a pleasant sensation. For thousands of years, before refrigeration, before chemistry, before any understanding of microbiology, pepper was one of the most effective tools humans had for making food safe to eat. Here is what piperine actually does inside a piece of rotting meat. It disrupts the cell membranes of certain harmful bacteria. It slows the growth of mold. It masks the smell and taste of decomposition, and it stimulates digestive enzymes in the human gut, helping the body process food that might otherwise cause illness. None of this was understood scientifically by ancient civilizations, but they observed the effects. Meat preserved with pepper lasted longer. People who ate pepper got sick less often. In a world where a bad winter could mean starvation, and a spoiled food supply could wipe out an army, these effects were not trivial. They were the difference between survival and collapse. The pepper plant, Piper nigrum, is native to the Western Ghats, a mountain range running along the southwestern coast of India, in what is now the state of Kerala. For thousands of years, this region had a near-complete monopoly on global pepper production. The plant grew wild in the forest understory, climbing up trees with its thick, glossy vines, producing clusters of small green berries that turned red when ripe and shriveled into the familiar black peppercorn when dried in the sun. The people of Kerala figured out, long before anyone else, that you could harvest these berries at different stages of ripeness to produce different flavors and heat levels. Green pepper, harvested early. Black pepper, dried fully. White pepper, soaked to remove the outer skin. Each one slightly different, each one valuable. The earliest written record of pepper in trade comes from Sanskrit texts dating back roughly 3,000 years. The Mahabharata, one of the great Hindu epics, mentions pepper specifically as a luxury item. By around 600 BCE, pepper was already moving along established trade routes from Kerala north to the Ganges Plain and west toward the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. But the scale of that trade was still relatively local. The transformation happened when it crossed the Arabian Sea and reached Rome. The Romans were obsessed with pepper in a way that is difficult to fully explain from a modern perspective. Apicius, the Roman cookbook compiled sometime around the 1st century CE, mentions pepper in nearly every single recipe. Not in some recipes, nearly every single one. Pepper appeared in meat dishes, in fish dishes, in sweet cakes, in wine. Roman writers complained that cooks were adding it to everything. One satirist wrote that the pepper merchants of Rome had more influence over daily life than the senators. This was not just a culinary preference. It was a status symbol. Pepper came from the ends of the known world, from a place most Romans would never see. Owning it meant wealth. Serving it meant power. And the Roman Empire consumed it in staggering quantities. The port of Musuris on the Kerala coast, now believed to be near the modern town of Pattanam, was described by ancient writers as a place where Roman ships arrived so frequently that their anchors could be seen tangled together in the harbor. A 1st century papyrus discovered in Egypt records a single merchant's order, over 2 million sesterti worth of pepper, in one transaction. That is roughly equivalent to tens of millions of dollars in purchasing power today. When the Visigoth king Alaric sacked Rome in 410 CE, his ransom demand included 3,000 pounds of pepper. Not gold, not silver, not territory. Pepper. That is how central it had become to Roman economic thinking. The Roman state collected pepper as tribute. Roman doctors prescribed it for everything from indigestion to malaria, and Roman traders had sailed so far to obtain it that they had essentially mapped the entire coastline of southern Asia centuries before European cartographers officially recorded it. While Rome was sending ships to Kerala, the Arab world was building something more durable. A trade network that would survive the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, the Crusades, and nearly 1,000 years of political upheaval. Arab merchants understood something the Romans had not fully systematized. The key was not to sail to the source. The key was to control the middle. By the 7th and 8th centuries, Arab traders had established themselves as the indispensable link between the pepper producers of Kerala and the consumers of the Mediterranean world. They controlled the ports of the Arabian Sea. They controlled the camel caravan routes across the Persian Gulf. They controlled the warehouses of Alexandria, of Basra, of Aden, and they controlled the information. For centuries, Arab merchants told wildly inaccurate stories about where pepper came from. One popular account claimed it grew in a forest guarded by venomous serpents that had to be burned out before the harvest could begin. Another claimed it was found at the edge of the world, near the rising sun. These stories were not superstition. They were deliberate disinformation. If European buyers knew where pepper actually grew and how to get there directly, the Arab monopoly would collapse. As long as the source remained mysterious and terrifying, Arab merchants could charge whatever they wanted. And for roughly 700 years, they did. Venice, Genoa, and the other Italian city-states served as the European end of this chain. They bought from Arab merchants at enormous markups and sold to the rest of Europe at even larger ones. The word spice became synonymous with extreme luxury in the way that luxury car or designer label might be today. Pepper was locked behind layers of middlemen, each one taking a cut, each one adding to a price that, by the time it reached a kitchen in Paris or London, was roughly 30 to 40 times what it had cost at the source. This is the world that fell apart in 1453. When the Ottomans took Constantinople and began imposing tariffs on the overland spice routes, the Italian city-states that had grown fat on pepper profits began to panic, and the kingdoms on the western edge of Europe, Portugal and Spain in particular, suddenly saw an opportunity. If the eastern routes were blocked, and if the Arab middlemen controlled the sea routes through the Arabian Sea, then the only answer was to find a completely new way around. Portugal moved first. Prince Henry, later called Henry the Navigator, began funding systematic expeditions down the coast of Africa, starting in the 1420s. His goal was not exploration for its own sake. It was pepper. He wanted to find a sea route to Kerala that bypassed the Arab and Ottoman systems entirely. His sailors were terrified. Medieval European maps showed the equator as a line of fire. South of it, supposedly, the ocean boiled. Sea monsters lurked beyond the known charts. The wind, it was believed, would not blow ships back north once they had crossed certain latitudes. All of these fears turned out to be wrong. Portuguese sailors crossed the equator, survived, and kept going south, and further south still. In 1488, Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the southern tip of Africa, now called the Cape of Good Hope, and proved that the Indian Ocean could be reached by sea from Europe. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama completed the full journey. He sailed around Africa, crossed the Indian Ocean, and arrived at the pepper port of Calicut in Kerala in 1498. The Arab merchants at Calicut were not pleased. They had controlled this trade for centuries. They had no intention of sharing it. They told the local ruler, the Zamorin of Calicut, that the Portuguese were pirates and should not be trusted. Da Gama returned to Portugal with a cargo of pepper and spices that, when sold in Lisbon, earned roughly 60 times the cost of the entire expedition. The entire expedition, both ships, 2 years, 60 times the investment. That is the margin that had been sitting with Arab and Italian middlemen for 700 years. Portugal immediately moved to control it by force. They built fortified trading posts called feitorias along the Indian coast. They seized Arab merchant ships. They bombarded ports that refused to trade exclusively with them. Within 30 years of da Gama's first voyage, the Portuguese had used military force to insert themselves as the new, indispensable middlemen in the global pepper trade. The Arab merchants who had held that position for centuries were simply outgunned. But Portugal could not hold the monopoly forever. By the late 1500s, the Dutch were watching. The Dutch Republic, a small nation built on trade, finance, and an extraordinary tolerance for risk, looked at the Portuguese pepper monopoly and decided to break it. In 1602, Dutch merchants established the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. It was, in legal structure, something the world had never quite seen before. A joint stock company with its own army, its own navy, its own right to declare war, and sign treaties, all funded by shareholders who bought shares in Amsterdam coffee houses and expected dividends. The first major product the VOC was designed to deliver was pepper. Within decades, the Dutch had displaced the Portuguese from most of their trading posts in Asia. They established a permanent headquarters in Batavia, what is now Jakarta, Indonesia, and built an empire of trading posts and military fortifications stretching from southern Africa to Japan. The VOC would go on to become the single most valuable company in history. At its peak in the 1630s, it was worth roughly $4 trillion in today's money, larger than Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon combined. And its foundation was laid on pepper. The British were not far behind. The British East India Company, chartered in 1600, just 2 years before the VOC, followed a similar path. What started as a pepper trading venture eventually became the administrative structure of the entire British Raj in India, a colonial apparatus that governed 300 million people by the early 20th century. Think about that chain of causality. Pepper, trade routes, corporate charters, colonial armies, an empire. The modern world looks the way it does in significant part because Europeans wanted pepper badly, enough to sail around the world to get it. And then, with almost no drama, pepper stopped being scarce. The problem with any monopoly built on geography is that geography can be overcome. Once the sea routes to Kerala were open and mapped, anyone with a ship could sail them. The Dutch and British tried to control production rather than just trade, but pepper is not a plant that cooperates. It grows in humid tropical climates across a wide band of the earth. Once seeds were carried beyond Kerala, to Sumatra, to Borneo, to Brazil, to Vietnam, the plant thrived. By the 1800s, pepper was being grown on multiple continents. American merchants from Salem, Massachusetts, a small port city that barely registers on the modern map, had built a direct trade with Sumatra that made it, for a brief moment, one of the wealthiest ports in the United States. Salem merchants were trading directly with Sumatran pepper farmers, cutting out every middleman and selling pepper in American cities at prices that would have seemed impossible a century earlier. Mechanical processing, steamships, and refrigeration did the rest. By the time chemical refrigeration became widespread in the 20th century, the original reason pepper mattered so much, preserving food, had been superseded entirely. Refrigerators did not need pepper. The price collapsed. A spice that had funded empires became background seasoning. Today, the world produces roughly 500,000 tons of pepper every year. Vietnam is now the world's largest producer. A country that did not even register in ancient pepper trade discussions. Kerala, the birthplace of the trade, now competes for market share in a global commodity market, where the price is set not by armed merchants in harbors, but by futures traders, staring at screens in Singapore and Chicago. A jar of black pepper costs $2 in most American grocery stores. Adjusted for purchasing power, it is cheaper than at any point since human beings first tasted it. There is something both wonderful and quietly unsettling about that. For 2,000 years, pepper shaped the fate of nations. It determined which cities grew rich and which stayed poor. It sent men around the tip of Africa in wooden ships held together with rope and tar. It funded the construction of the trading houses of Amsterdam and the colonial forts of Goa and Malacca. It gave birth to the concept of the joint stock company, the legal invention that would eventually become the corporation, the organizing structure of the modern economy. And it gave us the map, not metaphorically, literally. Many of the sea charts that defined European understanding of the world's coastlines were drawn by sailors looking for pepper. The shape of Africa on your atlas, the outline of the Indian coastline. the routes across the Pacific, all of them traced, in part, by men who were following the smell of a spice, and now it sits on your table next to the salt. And nobody thinks about it at all. That gap between what pepper once was and what it is now tells you something important about the nature of value. Value is not fixed. It is not intrinsic. It is a story that a civilization tells itself about what it needs badly enough to suffer for. For 2,000 years, the story of pepper was also the story of scarcity. Hard to grow, harder to move, easiest to control. Whoever controlled the choke points, the ports, the routes, the warehouses, controlled the price. And whoever controlled the price controlled something that everyone needed. But once technology dissolved the choke points, the story changed. The pepper stayed the same. The piperine still hits the same receptors. Your body still responds the same way. What changed was the world around it. And this pattern does not stop with pepper or salt. Look at what is happening right now with oil, or with rare earth minerals needed for batteries, or with clean water in certain regions. Every era has its pepper, the resource so essential, so unevenly distributed, that whoever controls it shapes history for everyone else. The lesson is not that these resources will always matter. The lesson is that they will matter enormously until suddenly they do not. And the transition is almost never peaceful. So, the next time you crack black pepper over your dinner, that simple, automatic gesture, so habitual you barely register doing it. Try to hold both things at once, the $2 jar in your hand and the wooden ship rounding Africa in a storm. The satellite-tracked container vessel delivering 500 tons of Vietnamese pepper to a warehouse in Rotterdam, and the Arab merchant in Aden 800 years ago, spinning careful stories about serpent-guarded forests to protect the most valuable secret in the medieval world. All of that history, the empires, the wars, the voyages, the lies, the maps, compressed into a tiny dried berry that dissolves on your tongue and disappears. Here is something I want you to think about as you go about the rest of your day. If you had been a merchant in the 1400s, and you knew that somewhere at the edge of the world, there was a route to the source of pepper that nobody else had found yet, would you have risked everything to find it? Would the potential reward have been worth the danger? Write your answer in the comments below. I genuinely want to know. If this story opened something up for you, a new way of seeing an ordinary thing, then hit the like button and subscribe to Woven English. We tell history through the objects and ideas that shaped the world while most people were looking somewhere else. There is more coming, a lot more. Thank you for spending this time with Woven English. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and remember, the most ordinary things often carry the most extraordinary stories. We will see you in the next one.